Hey there, Dr. Alan Christensen here with you. And the question we get is, but microwaves, they're radiation, they're dangerous, they're bad. So let's talk through all this stuff and make good sense of it. For starters, we've really got to define radiation. So what is radiation anyway? Well, it's pretty fascinating. It's a particle that moves like a wave. And we call that particle a quanta, a little tiny unit. And this wave can be here's a low amplitude wave, here's a high amplitude wave. So that amplitude is the energy of the wave. Now there's also the wavelength, which is the difference from peak to peak, like an ocean wave. So here's a short wavelength, here's a long wavelength. So the wavelength determines how this interacts with things. Now there's two big categories of radiation, and these are all on what's called the electromagnetic spectrum. We talk about ionizing radiation and then non-ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation means that it can create ions. And an ion means a chemical change. So if you've got an atom and you've got this little cloud of electrons around the atom, if there's a wave that is such a short wavelength that it may move up or down within that electron cloud, it could ping an electron out and it could chemically change that substance. And that's ionizing it. So that's a big deal for our DNA. You know, ionizing effects can cause cells to mutate and can cause cancer to form. Big deal, no debate. Now, if the wavelength is longer than the diameter of that electron cloud, you cannot ionize with that radiation. It just won't do that. You can change things physically. So think about like a scrambled egg. You cook it. You can't unscramble it when it's even after it's been scrambled. Once it's been cooked, when it's a cooked egg, the proteins have changed on a three-dimensional basis. So the molecules have bent and wrapped themselves together, but it didn't change chemically. So all the same chemicals are there before and after cooking. And that's the difference between ionizing and not ionizing. Ionizing radiation causes chemical changes. Non-ionizing radiation does not cause chemical changes. So let's talk through some types. So non-ionizing radiation, some of the weakest types, the Earth itself. The Earth has electromagnetic fields that it puts out. These are extremely long waves. Then we think about like power lines and their EMFs. These are also long waves. And then we think also about like radio waves. Radio waves are on the orders of miles between, which is why they can go over mountains and still cover great deals of distance, especially when they have high amplitude, high energy radio waves. TV waves, cell waves, these are all, I'm getting now to shorter and shorter wavelengths. Next up would be microwaves. And there's microwaves used in cooking and microwaves used in satellite relays. And past microwaves, now we think about the infrared spectrum. So most heating goes on in the infrared spectrum, which is a higher energy, shorter wavelength than microwaves are. So infrared heat, if you were here right now, you would feel warmth. You know, if you're next to someone and they're holding you, or if you've got a whole lot of people in one room, it gets hot. You know, people are like light bulbs. We give off some heat. Well, that's infrared heat. And also if you cook things, like if you throw some potatoes wrapped in foil in a campfire and let them cook for a while, well, they're receiving infrared heat. Now, if you boil some water on a stove, gas flame, electric stove, that's infrared heat. You're heating that. And guess what? Those are radiation. You're heating with radiation. You know, if you're next to someone sleeping at night and they're warming you up, it's because it's radiation that's warming you. These are all versions of radiation. Now, shorter wavelengths past infrared radiation heat becomes visible light. And visible light, narrow spectrum, but the color differences are there. So infrared goes to red, and then what? Blue, indigo, violet, eventually. No, green, indigo, violet, blue, indigo, violet. But anyway, past here we get ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is now ionizing radiation. And that's UV light. So that's getting a sunburn. And that's the higher risk for skin cancer. That's where ionizing radiation starts, is ultraviolet light. Everything out here is not ionizing. The Earth's fields, the microwaves, the radiation from your sleeping partner, that's radiation, but that's not ionizing radiation. So ultraviolet is the first version of ionizing radiation. Then we've got higher energy waves like X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays. And what these things do is they're such short wavelengths that they actually do induce chemical changes. They can ionize the food and they can alter the chemistry of things. And more so, that's altering the chemistry of living things. So ionizing radiation can cause mutations, which can form cancer. Sadly, those mutations don't give superpowers. Think about like taking a book. A mutation is just scrambling things up. So if you took the book Hamlet by Shakespeare and you could randomly redistribute the letters, it wouldn't turn into Moby Dick, or it wouldn't turn into Gulliver's Travels, or it wouldn't turn into like Super Hamlet. It would just be gibberish in almost all cases. And so too with mutations. They're really not good in almost all cases. So, but what about microwaves? Don't they nuke food? Isn't that the term that we hear a lot? The microwaves are nuking food. Well, so nuke implies like nuclear energy. And nuclear energy does use gamma rays. And those do use ionizing radiation. That's dangerous. But no, microwaves are not nuclear energy. They're radiation in a milder version of radiation than the stovetop is, in all honesty. So do they emit radiation? No, they don't emit radiation either. Do they change food proteins? They do structurally the same way that any kind of cooking does. And again, eggs are a great example. You cook an egg, and now that liquid is solid. So you denatured, you physically change the protein, and any kind of heat can do that. Last summer there was a day where it was, I think we hit 120, and we put an egg in a large black cast iron skillet out on the patio in the direct sunlight. It wasn't as dramatic or as fast as I was expecting, but it did change physically. It did become a cooked egg. And that's a physical change. It's not a chemical change. It's all the same atoms that make up that egg. So then a practical question, do microwaves destroy nutrients? Well, compared to heating on a stovetop, microwave foods from some studies have had higher levels of thiamine, riboflavin, B6, folate, vitamin C. Minerals don't change regardless of how you're cooking because minerals are chemical elements. You can't change them without taking things away. So if you do use more water when you're cooking and you don't use that water, that will take away a lot of nutrients. My favorite trick is whenever you're boiling something, I don't boil stuff much anyway, but if you do, keep that liquid and use that for your smoothies or your juices. You'll preserve the nutrients that way. There were several big studies I saw that gave exact content of nutrients in broccoli, and they cooked it many different ways and also looked at how much it was in there raw. So we can see raw, boiled, steamed, microwave, stir-fried, or stir-fried after boiling. And what we saw was that vitamin C content, chlorophyll content, the carotenoid content, and even some of the fun exotic things in broccoli, like the glucosinolates, there really wasn't a big problem based upon microwaving over other cooking methods. In some cases, it was about the same, a tiny bit worse, but in most cases, it was the same or better. And if you look at these charts, it was fascinating because there's many cases to where cooking ended up being better than raw as far as nutrient content. There was 1 or 2 cases where raw was better, but not all. So nothing bad about cooking inherently, and microwaving actually preserved more nutrients than it lost compared to other cooking methods. So big picture, microwaves are not radiation. They're actually a really safe way to cook food that may even raise many nutrients. People who've been concerned about them have had a valid concern about ionizing radiation. That's just something different. Radiation is a bigger term. Being next to a warm person is still radiation. So take great care of yourselves. Dr. Christensen here. We'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.